you've been around on this channel for a little while, you will know that I love vintage sewing patterns, and I mean I really love them. And there are lots of reasons why I love them so much. Firstly, they tend to fit me better than modern Big Four patterns. I'm also just a huge vintage dress enthusiast, and the best way to get that authentic look is with a vintage pattern. But also, the historian in me just loves the tangible link to the past that comes with vintage sewing patterns. The study of dress history usually focuses on the fashionable elite, but these patterns were used by ordinary dressmakers to make ordinary clothes for ordinary people. And really, those are the people who fascinate me. However, actually sewing with a vintage sewing pattern can be challenging, but don't worry, I'm here to help you out and demystify the whole process. So the first thing you need to know about using vintage sewing patterns is that depending on the era, they usually come pre-cut in one size. This can be really helpful because you don't have to faff around cutting out all the pattern pieces in the correct size, but it often isn't ideal. I know I'm certainly a different size for my bust and my hips, and not being able to grade between sizes is a loss. But generally, I quite like the one size per envelope thing. However, that does mean that you have to look out for vintage patterns specifically in your size. You can of course grade your patterns up or down, but really that's a whole nother skill, and maybe I'll talk about that in another video, but honestly, I really hate grading patterns, so I tend to only buy the patterns I know are in my size. But here's the thing. Vintage pattern sizes are different to modern sewing pattern sizes, and are also different if the pattern is a Mrs. pattern, which are also different to ready-to-wear clothing sizes. So the whole sizing thing is super confusing. The way forward is just to buy patterns based on your bust measurement for dresses or tops, your waist measurement if the pattern is for flared skirts, and your hip measurement for fitted skirts. These, of course, are usually given in inches. So you've managed to get your hands on a banging sewing pattern that's in your size. Congratulations! Before we can get started, it's a good idea to check that the pattern is complete. This is made more complicated by the fact that the tissue pattern pieces don't have any printed information on them, just these punched perforations. So to check that all the pattern pieces are there, make sure to check them against the diagram on the back of the pattern envelope that looks like this. You can of course just count the pattern pieces, but I've had a couple of occasions when I've ended up with 2 E pattern pieces or something because over the pattern's 80-year life, something else has gotten in there that shouldn't, or equally something else has gone missing, or the wrong pattern is in the wrong envelope. This tends to be less of an issue if you're buying your patterns from an online seller because they usually list any missing pieces. But if you pick up your patterns at car boot sales or vintage fairs, it is definitely worth checking. It's also a good idea to double check how much seam allowance the pattern has included. I discovered in the instructions for this pattern that there had originally been an extra margin that you were supposed to cut away whilst cutting out the fabric, but it looked like this pattern had already been trimmed down. It also took me a while to hunt down how much seam allowance this pattern had. It is usually in the first cutting section of the instructions, but this pattern didn't mention it until the sewing instructions began, and in the form of this tiny note. That's the thing with vintage patterns. They make you do a lot of work to figure out what's going on. Now that we've got all those pattern pieces out on the table, it's a really good time to give everything a measure to make sure it is going to fit. This is always a good idea, even with modern patterns, but it's especially important with vintage patterns due to the whole wacky sizing thing. As this pattern has a pretty standard bodice construction, I used my self-drafted bodice block to compare the fit. I began by matching the block to the pattern at the shoulder. As my block has no seam allowance, I measure in 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the original pattern. Then I begin to pivot my darts so that they are in approximately the same position as the ones on the pattern. They don't quite match up, but I measure the width of the darts on the original pattern to check that they are at least the same width. I then study the sketches on the envelope so that I have a good idea of the style lines of the garment and how it's supposed to fit. This block has wider shoulders than the vintage pattern, but the block was designed to have sleeves and the pattern is sleeveless, so I choose to keep the narrower shoulders of the vintage pattern. The position of the armhole is spot on, so I will trace that off of the vintage pattern too. It turns out that despite my measurements matching the pattern almost exactly, the bust is much too big and the bodice front too long. Keep in mind of course that the block doesn't have seam allowance, so even though it looks too big at the waist, once seam allowance is taken into account, the fit is perfect. For the back, again, I start at the shoulder. You can see that my shoulder is at a dramatically different angle to the pattern. Again, the armhole looks just fine, so I measure the dart to make sure it is the correct width.
Like on the front, the pattern is too big at the bust, but this time it's too small at the waist, so I'll need to add some width there. I like using my block to adjust patterns as it means fewer calculations, and I can avoid having to convert everything from inches.
You may have heard other sewists complain about the enormous amount of ease that often comes in Big 4 patterns, and you can see that it turns out that was also a thing in the 1940s. So make sure to double check your measurements against the pattern. I then began to trace the pattern off and make my fit adjustments. You can of course cut up, right on, alter your vintage patterns if you want to, but I like to keep mine in as original condition as possible because I'm an archive nerd, and also because that means I can sell them on to someone else when I'm done with it. With the outlines traced, now we have to tackle all those weird perforations. At first they seem like just a random bunch of holes in the pattern, but if you study the instructions, they should tell you everything you need. See, these circles in the middle join up to be the straight of grain mark. These small circles indicate darts, and these big circles mark the pleats. This system of perforations tends to be pretty standard across sewing pattern brands. However, the exception that I have noticed is the markings for cutting things on the fold. They tend to vary, so make sure to double check those before cutting. With all those little circles decoded, I then label the pattern pieces with literally all the information I could ever need to know. Which piece it is, which pattern it is from, what size, how many to cut and of what, and adjustments I've made, and the seam allowance. Then, before I start cutting my tracing paper, I make sure to safely store the original tissue pattern piece back in the pattern envelope so I don't accidentally chop it in half or trace it again or something. Then I cut the tracing paper piece out and repeat for the rest of the pattern. If I've made an alteration to one piece that affects the shape of another piece, say a facing, I make sure to adjust that piece to match my traced version of the pattern, not the original vintage one. Right, that's it. We're ready to start cutting. The toile, of course. If you want to live dangerously and dive right into the real thing, go for it. But be prepared that you might hit a number of issues along the way, especially if you've had to make alterations to the fit of the pattern. A toile, or a mock-up, will give you a chance to double check the fit, double check that you've interpreted all those funny little circles correctly, and give you some practice deciphering those often rather vague sewing instructions. For my toile, it turned out I had shortened the centre front just a bit too much. But apart from that, it fit just how I wanted it to. I'm going to be making up this pattern in my next video, so if you'd like to see how that turns out, you can always subscribe to this channel and YouTube will let you know when it's live. I would also like to say hello to everyone who has joined us here since COVID. I had lots of wonderful comments on my Sewing with a Disability video and some excellent suggestions that I will definitely be trying out myself. But I'd like to know a bit more about you and your sewing projects other than the ingenious things you do with magnets and ironing boards. So let me know in the comments a bit about what you're working on or the kind of costumes you like to make. I can generally be found hanging out in the mid-20th century, but all that is about to change. Thanks for watching. See you next time.